of God. The word fear itself is used in different ways in the Scripture. To fear God is to be obedient. And the Scriptures that you know is fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the duty of every individual. And then the fear of God means reverence for Him. Reverence to the Lord personally, reverence to His house, or His synagogue, or His temple. And then another fear of God is the honor that we do and the respect that we have for God. And it is just as necessary, and actually does not actually mean that you are afraid of God. Only a person who has a guilty conscience is afraid of God. Make all kinds of excuses and say, oh, I'm afraid that you are a hard-hearted God. God said, how do you know that I'm a hard-hearted God? I've always treated you with love and benevolence. You don't need to fear God. But only when we have sinned and have not repented and have not corrected our ways, then there is real fear. And so fear of God is mostly reverential. The Protestants use a text very often to prove that all they have to do is, what does the Scripture say? And now, what doth the Lord thy God require of thee? But to fear the Lord thy God, to walk in all His ways, and to love Him, and to serve Him, the Lord thy God, with all thy heart and with all thy soul. And they'll use that quite frequently and say, that is my position in serving the Lord. And I says, yes, but that's only half the verse. Oh, no, it isn't. Well, the verse they're quoting is one in Joshua and one in Micah that speaks just like what I've read to you. But the one in Deuteronomy says, right after it says, what does the Lord require of thee? But to fear the Lord thy God, and to walk in all His ways, and to love Him, and to serve the Lord thy God, and to keep His commandments. That's what we want to memorize. And when someone says to you, I'm just here to keep good judgment, and have mercy, and have fellowship with my neighbor, that's all that's required of me. You say, no, that's only half the verse. The verse also includes that we love the Lord with all our heart and all our mind, and that means that we will be commandment-keeping people, won't it? Now therefore, fear the Lord and serve Him in sincerity and in truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the flood and in Egypt, and serve ye the Lord. 1 Chronicles 16:30. Notice the serving of the Lord begins with fearing the Lord, putting our innermost feelings first. What do we think of God? How do we treat God? How do we act around Him? And so this is why it's there. What does the Lord require of thee but to fear the Lord thy God? Let us now hear the conclusion of the whole matter. This is in Ecclesiastes 12:13 now. What's the conclusion of everything? To fear God and keep His commandments. For this, I've already quoted this. This is the whole duty of man. Isaiah 8:13, that's another verse that makes us think. Sanctify the Lord of hosts Himself, and let Him be your fear. and let him be your dread. Here again, dread is not meaning to be afraid, to want to run away, or to hide under something. That fear comes when the Lord comes on the clouds of heaven, and the men here on earth will look up and see him and say, "Oh, let the rocks and mountains fall on us," because they really have the fear for seeing the Lord coming, seeing the saints caught up to meet the Lord in the air, they themselves left here for judgment. And then final, death in the lake of fire. That is the bodily fear, the fear of ourselves. But let us fear the Lord, and then we won't have that fear when we see him coming in the clouds. Matthew 10:28 says, "And fear not them which kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul, but rather fear him which is able to destroy both body and soul." This is a theological statement that Jesus made. Excuse me. Made it in 10:28. How can a person take away your body and your soul? That's because your belief, your doctrines that you are clinging to, the truth that you know, and when someone robs you of that truth, of what is in the cover of the Bible, they can take you away from the real truth. And when you lose the real truth, you have dreadful fear, because then you can lose body and soul in that operation. The Apostle Peter spoke concerning this. "And if you call on the Father, who without respect of persons judgeth according to every man's work, pass the time of your sojourning here in fear. Honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king." So this is the Apostle Peter's statements concerning the fear that we must have. And fear is reverential, as I said earlier. Even as we are gathered together here in this little building, we must reverence it. Because here's where we meet God. Here's where we speak about his power and his spirit coming into us. God is certainly sacred. And the surroundings around God are sacred. Number of times in Scripture we read, "Take off your shoes from your feet, for this is hallowed ground where God has stood." The most holy place in the tabernacle and the most holy place in the temple, all were there to show the people that God is powerful, and that his glory is like fire, and that his presence is great light, and his glory is wonderful. God is greatly to be feared in the assembly of the saints, and to be had in reverence of them that are about him. Psalms 111:9. So this place here is a holy place, a holy building, and we should reverence it. I heard a mother say concerning her children, which were very unruly in church, ran all over the place, ran around the pulpit, did everything noisy and obnoxious. Well, they learned that from another mother and her children. And I observed both, and it was the parents' fault that the children were not properly behaving in church. I'm glad it doesn't happen here in our little edifice, that we continue to honor it, because we come here and ask God for the blessings, we ask God for healing, We ask God to answer the prayers of other folks that have asked us to pray for them. And so reverence is necessary. And how often do we see that Scripture tells us God is greatly to be feared in the assembly of the saints? And that statement is made 4 times in Scripture. In Habakkuk 2:20, but the Lord is in his holy temple, that all the earth keep silence before him. That's why we are quiet here in this little room. So when we fear God, we also show honor to him, and honor to his name, and to honor the things that God has done in the past. When we see the creation of God, and we say, oh, how great thou art, even though it has been marred by man with his war machinery, with his other acts of vandalism to the earth, we can still see God's beauty here and there. But just think what was that beauty when God created the garden and placed it in the land of Eden. There has to be restoration made. There has to be made a new heaven and a new earth. After the millennium is over and the earth has been purified, so that God can come back here and enjoy the earth that he created like he did when he created this earth as is 6,000 years ago, and he walked through the garden and said, Adam, how are you today? And Adam and God, and Adam and Eve often conversed together and enjoyed the creation of God. Another thought comes to us, that we honor God by respecting and listening to his Son. God has turned everything over to his Son at the present time. Jesus is like God at the present time. He not is God, but he is like God. Because he was an obedient Son, we read in Colossians that God has made him the principal power until this earth has been made pure and the earth has been sanctified. In the resurrection chapter, 1 Corinthians 15, we read that Jesus will rule until all man has been processed to be whether he is righteous or whether he's wicked, whether he will live for eternity or be put into the lake of fire. And when death and hell, death and the place of the dead, that's what hell means, cemetery. When the death and the place of the dead has all been cleansed, then this earth becomes again the ruling place for God. And as we read in 1 Corinthians 15, Jesus will turn back the power that he has now to his Father, that God can be all in all again, and that God can be feared completely with reverence as he was originally. We can't understand God because God can't be near sin. That's why our prayers also have to be translated by the Spirit of God before God in godly language. There is no language that's a pure language on earth here. Every language has filth in it. And so God does not come down to this earth at the present time. Moses asked God, let me see what you look like. And God says, no man can see God and live, because he is such a great creation. So we can't understand it. Why wouldn't God let Moses look at it? God cannot be near sin. The area around where God is holy ground. Every place on earth has to be made pure, clean, so that God can come back to earth and rule here as Jesus is going to rule for the millennium. And Jesus turns over the kingdom to God. Notice some of the verses in Scripture where God was near and told the people to reverence the ground. The captain of the Lord's host, right, in other words, a captain of the angels of heaven, said unto Joshua, loose thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy. And Joshua did so. Psalm 4:4, stand in awe and sin not. Commune with your own heart upon your bed and be still. The psalmist continues in 33:8, let all the earth fear the Lord, and let all the inhabitants of the world stand in awe of him, or in fear of him. Psalms 89:7, God is greatly to be feared in the assembly of his saints, and to be had in reverence in all them that are about him. And these verses all should make us to put to memory that reverence for God is necessary. We learn of the greatness of God through Christ. When Christ prayed to his Father, it really are reverential prayers when God spoke to his Father. And so as we speak to the Father, let our prayers also be of reverence and fear to him, and to remember always to be obedient, to keep the commandments, for this is the whole duty of man.